Department without the benefit of a background investigation.
Otepka replied that he could not issue a clearance for Walt Rostow because he already had been investigated by the CIA and the Air Force, and on both occasions was found not to be suitable for employment because of security questions.
This made the secretary, and particularly Bobby Kennedy, very unhappy, and Kennedy said, in referring to the decision of the Air Force to turn Rostow down on a prior occasion, he said, "Those Air Force generals who did this are a bunch of jerks."
Shortly after this meeting took place, Walt Rostow, the man who was denied a security clearance by the CIA, the Air Force, and the State Department, was appointed by President Kennedy to be his special assistant in none other than National Security Affairs. The Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs under the Kennedy administration was Harlan Cleveland. Cleveland had approached Otepka to see if there was some way to get Alger Hiss back into the State Department after his release from prison. Cleveland himself had been hired only after the Security Evaluations Division had been ordered from above to waive the usual pre-employment security check of his background. Cleveland was responsible for selecting a special committee of 10 experts to rewrite the internal security procedures for Americans employed at the UN.
They were all allies and associates of Alger Hiss. The 10 people that I mentioned earlier, who Cleveland wanted on his committee to reform security procedures. They reformed them all right. They abolished them.
In 1963, Otto Otepka was called to testify before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. One of the disclosures made in that testimony was the case of William Wieland. Wieland had been a State Department officer in charge of Cuban affairs. He played a key role in shaping the U.S. pro-Castro policy during the critical days of Castro's takeover in Cuba. Otepka had discovered that Wieland, at the time of obtaining employment in the State Department, had concealed information about his past, including an unresolved allegation that he had been connected with the Cuban Communist Party. Otepka also discovered that Wieland had concealed evidence that Castro was a communist.
There was just a preponderance of evidence showing that Fidel Castro was a communist. Yet, William Wieland was advising his superiors, John Foster Dulles, and then when he died, Christian Herter, that there was no evidence that Castro was a communist, and that we should seek an accommodation with Castro and get rid of that right-wing dictator, Batista. When all of this was brought out in my evaluation report, I found out, that is, that Wieland had his supporters upstairs who immediately came to his rescue, who didn't want these facts to come out.
The strategy of the State Department was to force Otepka's resignation. His files were removed. He was denied access to department records. His phone was tapped and then disconnected. He was moved to a small office where his only assignment was to index the congressional record. But Otto Otepka did not yield to these pressures, and his superior, who had ordered the tapping of his telephone, was the one who was forced to resign. In the end, Otepka was vindicated. But conditions in the State Department did not change. William Wieland was promoted, and Otepka never again served as security evaluator, nor in fact did anyone else. The job itself was abolished. Part of the responsibility for screening employees of the State Department was transferred to the Civil Service Commission. But the Civil Service Commission had stopped even asking questions about employee loyalty to the United States. According to the Supreme Court, such questions are now unconstitutional.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The Watergate scandal that engulfed President Nixon in 1974 proved to be an unexpected source of help to the campaign against internal security. With the public preoccupied with stories of unethical behavior of White House officials, it became easier to sell the idea that the real threat to America was not from communist subversion, but from our own government. In Congress, this attitude was expressed by an increasing support for legislation to abolish the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which by this time had been renamed the House Committee on Internal Security. But even at the height of the Watergate backlash, the pro-abolition forces were easily defeated when the issue came to a vote. In 1974, the final vote was only 86 in favor of abolition, with 247 against. But the following January,